Scott McClellan was President Bush's second press secretary and earlier was a deputy to the first, Ari Fleischer, who served from 2001 to 2003. Ari, what do you think of this book and the charges made in it?
Well, I'm stumped and I'm stunned by it, Katie, because never did Scott ever come to me privately and express any of these thoughts. Neither did he harbor any hesitation when he was the press secretary. So I really don't know what led to this new revelation.
Well, does that mean he didn't necessarily have these feelings and perhaps was too timid to express them?
Or it's something that really came up very recently in the last several months, and I'm looking forward to hearing from Scott why. What could have led him to change 180 degrees so dramatically?
A lot of people seem to be saying in response to this book that this doesn't sound like the Scott McClellan they knew. Let's take a listen.
This doesn't sound like Scott. It really doesn't. Not the Scott McClellan I've known for a long time.
He's like a fundamentally different person than all of us knew.
The voice that comes out of this book is certainly not Scott McClellan's.
With all due respect, Ari, it sounds as if you all are operating from the same playbook. Did you get together and discuss how to respond to this?
No, I think it's just that we all worked shoulder to shoulder with Scott for so long. And we never heard Scott talk about manipulation, talk about propaganda. And I did talk to Scott yesterday, Katie, and Scott told me that his editor did tweak, in Scott's word, a lot of the writing, especially in the last few months. And so I am curious to hear when Scott does his interviews, does he use the word manipulation? Will he say propaganda? Is he comfortable in orally matching what he's written in this book?
So was he claiming when you spoke to him that his editor changed the intent of his words?
No, Scott just filled me in. I said to him, did you have a ghostwriter? And he said no, but in the last few months, particularly as the deadline was approaching, the editor tweaked the content. That's the way Scott put it to me. So nobody knows what that means until either the editor explains it or Scott explains it when he does interviews for his book.
Well, what did he say? Surely you asked him about that when he said his editor tweaked some of his words. Was he suggesting that they were trying to make the book more sensational?
Scott didn't fill that out. He made it sound as if as the deadline was approaching, the editor stepped up his work to help Scott finish it on time. I think that's what Scott was driving at. But since it certainly doesn't sound like Scott, I also wondered literally, did the editor write some sentences and then Scott say, yes, I'll keep that sentence in? How carefully did Scott look at those sentences? It sounds a lot like the president's harshest critics. And Scott has a right to change his tune, but I never would think Scott would sound like one of the president's harshest critics.
Well, certainly there have been so many books written that suggest this very notion that the president did embark on an aggressive, quote, political propaganda campaign instead of the truth to sell the Iraq war. This is not the first time that sentiment has been expressed.
But that's not what Scott would normally have said. That's what the president's most virulent opponents would say, particularly when you remember that it was the CIA who informed the president that Iraq had biological and chemical weapons. Nobody made that up. We reported what the CIA informed us. And now to say that that's propaganda, now to say that that's manipulation, that's what doesn't sound like Scott here. And I'm looking forward to his defense of that.
So he never once indicated that he had some issues with the message he was charged with delivering?
No, Katie, and you know, for me personally, as a spokesman back then, during the lead up to the war, Scott helped me get ready for the briefings, and then I went away on my honeymoon right after the November 2002 election, and Scott briefed the press and continued to say the very same things. So I don't know how now Scott can conclude that all of that was wrong if he harbored no misgivings back then. He and I were very close. I would have thought Scott would have come to me privately and said, this doesn't sound right, maybe you shouldn't say it. He never did that.
He writes that some of the things he said when he did serve as press secretary, particularly about the war, were, quote, sincere but also, quote, misguided. When you were press secretary in the lead up to the war, did you say anything that in hindsight, Ari, could be described that way, sincere but misguided?
Well, I'd say sincere but incorrect. I repeatedly said that we know Saddam has biological and chemical weapons. I said it because the CIA told us that was the fact, just as they told it to Bill Clinton and just as almost every intelligence agency around the world came to the same conclusion. That doesn't make it propaganda and it doesn't make it manipulation. That's where I draw the line with Scott.
McClellan also writes that the White House, quote, almost guaranteed that the use of force would become the only feasible option to deal with Iraq. You were there. Were other options, particularly diplomatic options, ever seriously considered?
Yeah, there was a serious stage in early 2003 where we thought Saddam might leave the country. And there were actually nations that had been talking to him about receiving him. That never came to be, but that was one of the things that looked like might happen late before the war broke out. And I think the president was always hoping that if Germany and France had come around and put heavy pressure on Saddam, it could have been resolved peacefully. But that crack in the coalition, I think, helped Saddam think that this will never come to force.
The president has very low approval ratings at this juncture. How do you think this will affect the way he is viewed by the American people?
Well, I'm sorry to say I think the president's numbers are baked into the cake, and this book won't change the numbers one way or another. All those who dislike him already dislike him, and the few people, the 30% left that approves his job, I think they're pretty unshakable. Nothing's going to change that.
And what have people said with whom you worked at the White House when they've talked about this book and about Scott McClellan authoring it?
Well, you know, one person said to me today, I feel like crying. It's just so hard to see that somebody who was always in the trenches, shoulder to shoulder, who never privately had any angst or misgivings, would do such a 180-degree turnaround at this late date, too. That's what's so hard to understand. I think there's just a sense of puzzlement at the White House about what's happened to Scott.
And if you had to speculate about what happened to Scott McClellan, what would you say?
I really don't know. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Scott explain it himself. He has a right to explain it. I want to hear it.
Ari Fleischer. Ari, thank you so much.
Thank you, Katie.